A person wakes up naturally when their body is ready. There is no alarm clock, no strict schedule, and no specific place they are required to go. They sit up, stretch, and ask themselves a single question about what they should do with their day. For 99% of human history, this scenario was not a hypothetical thought experiment, but the daily reality of every single morning for roughly 300,000 years. The answer to that morning question looked completely different from the kind of life you are living right now. Modern humans spend about 90,000 hours of their lives working, which represents roughly 1/3 of their entire waking existence dedicated to a job. But for the overwhelming majority of human history, jobs did not exist, meaning there was no employment, no wages, no boss, and no career ladder to climb. So what did people actually do with their time all day? Let us start with the facts that we know for certain. In 1963, archaeologist Richard Lee conducted a study that would change how we understand prehistoric life. He tracked the daily activities of the Doju Hansi people in Botswana, one of the few remaining groups still living in a way that resembles pre-agricultural human life. He found that adults spent about 2.5 days per week acquiring food, which is roughly 17 hours. The rest of the time, they did whatever they wanted. The important part is that this pattern shows up everywhere anthropologists look. We see it with the Hadza in Tanzania, the Ak in Paraguay, and the Martu in Australia, who live in completely different environments on different continents but show the same result. They spend about 15 to 20 hours per week on survival activities. For context, you probably work twice that amount of time. Some of you might think these are modern people and ask how we know ancient humans lived the same way. This is a fair question, and the answer comes from studying bones. When archaeologists compare the skeletons of ancient humans to early agricultural populations, the difference is dramatic. Farmers were shorter, and their bones show clear signs of nutritional deficiency. Their teeth were riddled with cavities from grain-heavy diets. They had arthritis in their spines from repetitive labor, and they died younger. Ancient human skeletons were taller, stronger, had healthier teeth, and showed less joint damage. Their bones tell a clear story that they were doing less repetitive physical labor, not more. But the most fascinating evidence comes from something archaeologists found that should not exist if survival was a constant struggle, which is art. In 1994, explorers discovered Chauvet Cave in southern France. Inside were paintings created roughly 30,000 years ago. Horses, lions, and rhinoceroses were rendered with perspective, shading, and movement. These were not crude stick figures, but sophisticated art that required skill, planning, and most importantly, time. Someone spent hours, maybe days, deep inside a cave by firelight painting animals on a wall. They did this not for survival or food, but for beauty, meaning, and simply to have something to do. In Blambo's Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found 100,000-year-old perforated shell beads, which are tiny holes drilled through seashells clearly meant to be strung together as jewelry. The nearest coastline was 20 kilometers away. Someone walked a 40-kilometer round trip just to collect shells, then spent hours carefully drilling holes with stone tools just to look good. In 2008, researchers found a 40,000-year-old flute carved from a vulture bone in Germany. It had 5 finger holes that were perfectly spaced, showing that whoever made this understood music and pitch and spent significant time crafting it. They did not make it for hunting or defense, but for music. These are not isolated finds. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, archaeological sites from 100,000 years ago onward are filled with evidence of decorative objects. These include carefully crafted tools far more elaborate than necessary for survival, and items that required hours of focused work with no immediate practical benefit. This is what people did when they were not securing food, choosing to create, decorate, and make things beautiful. So, let us reconstruct a typical day. You wake up around dawn, and the fire from last night is still smoldering. Someone adds wood to the fire, and you eat leftover meat or fish from yesterday, maybe with some nuts or berries collected the day before. Breakfast is a social time where people talk and plan loosely for the day, not because they have to, but because that is what humans do. Around mid-morning, a small group might leave the camp to hunt or gather, but the key is that you do not go out every day. If the hunt was successful 2 days ago and food is stored, you might not leave camp at all. You might spend the morning working on tools, sharpening a spear, weaving a basket, or scraping an animal hide to make it soft and usable. This is not work in the modern sense, as there is no clock and no supervisor. You do it because competence matters, because being skilled earns respect, and because making things well is part of being human. If hunting does happen, it is not the frantic chase you see in movies. Humans are persistence hunters who track animals at a steady jog for hours until they overheat and collapse. We are the only species that can do this effectively because we can sweat and regulate our body temperature while running. Most animals cannot do this, so we outlast them. The hunt might take 3 to 6 hours, including travel, and then the animal is carried back and butchered so everyone can eat. By early afternoon, the productive part of the day is essentially over. What happens next is what modern people find hardest to understand, which is both nothing and everything. People rest, sitting in the shade to talk, and they play with the children. They groom each other, picking through hair to reinforce social bonds. They make jewelry from shells, beads, or animal teeth, carve designs into bones or stones, and take naps. Anthropologist James Sussman documented that among the Juwanzi, adults spend roughly 6 hours per day in what he called social time. This is time spent not working and not sleeping, but just being with other people, talking, laughing, and telling jokes. Because in a world without money, police, or written contracts, your survival depends entirely on your relationships. If people do not like you, they do not have to share food when you are hungry. So, you invest enormous amounts of time in those bonds, not because it is productive, but because it is how humans stay human. Then the sun sets, and this is when something remarkable happens. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner analyzed hundreds of hours of conversation recordings from the Juwanzi. During the day, conversations were practical, focusing on who saw animal tracks, which plants were ready for harvest, or complaints about someone not sharing fairly. But at night, around the fire, 81% of conversations shifted to stories. They shared myths about how the world began, tales of ancestors who did impossible things, jokes that made everyone laugh, and adventures from far away. Wiesner argued that this is where human culture was actually born. It allowed thoughts about gods, spirits, the past, and the future, which are things you can only think about when your stomach is full and you are safe. And people did not go to sleep and stay asleep the way you do now. Historical records from medieval Europe and sleep studies from the 1990s confirm that before artificial light, humans slept in 2 phases. They would have a first sleep for about 4 hours, followed by a wakeful period of 1 to 2 hours in complete darkness, and then a second sleep for another 4 hours. So here is what a full day looked like. They spent about 4 to 6 hours securing food or making tools. They spent about 6 hours in social interaction, storytelling, grooming, and playing. They slept for about 8 hours in 2 separate phases. The rest of the time was spent resting, sitting, watching clouds, doing nothing in particular, and existing without needing to justify your existence through productivity. Then, about 10,000 years ago, something changed. Humans in the Fertile Crescent began planting seeds and domesticating animals, which marked the beginning of agriculture. And agriculture is a trap. Once you start farming, you can feed more people, which means you need more food, and more food means more farming. Within a few generations, populations exploded, and there was no going back because there were now too many mouths to survive by hunting and gathering, leaving you locked in. Farming required far more labor, including plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing, and defending crops from animals and raiders. The skeletal evidence is unambiguous that early farmers worked harder, ate worse, and died younger than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. But the population kept growing. With larger populations came specialists, such as toolmakers, potters, weavers, and inventors. These were followed by soldiers, priests, administrators, and eventually jobs, employment, and the idea that your time belonged to someone else in exchange for resources. By the time we built cities, the original human lifestyle was gone, replaced by schedules, obligations, and the need to work most of your waking hours just to survive in the system we created. Today, you spend 90,000 hours working, while your ancestors spent way less. You sleep in one block and call waking up at 2 in the morning insomnia, whereas they slept in 2 phases and used the middle hours for reflection. You spend your life chasing an illusion of greatness, achievements, wealth, and success by standards that society invented. They woke up every morning already free, already enough, and at peace with nothing to prove to anyone. They did not need to become successful because they were already living the life you are working your entire existence to retire into. You make art if you can find time after your job, but they made art because they had time. And that is what humans do. We are not a different species, but we live so differently from how humans lived for 99% of our existence that we might as well be. We traded freedom for food security, leisure for population growth, and time for productivity.